planned introduction redundant. So it's always the risk of going last. But yeah, no, thank you to Interact Manchester for having me down to speak here, and thanks to both the fellow speakers. So I've been asked to speak tonight on the much vaunted end of neoliberalism. Obviously, as I'm sure a lot of us will have noticed, the neoliberal consensus has been severely damaged since the recent financial crash, as Grace has just very adequately displayed. I disagree with James here. I think you can actually define neoliberalism. I think that there's a mixture of financial deregulation, fiscal austerity and tax cuts. Not necessarily a decline in state expenditure, certainly not a decline in state debt, but I think that those three facets are clear examples of neoliberal policies enacted. I think it's worth noting that the countries who are most committed to fiscal austerity in Europe have been, again, as Grace said, amongst the worst in terms of the recovery from the 2007 crash. You've got examples like Greece, Ireland, until recently Spain, the UK. It's a clear parallel here. Our recovery as a proportion of the economy in terms of employment is basically on par with Greece. It's terrible. So there's lots of grand political movements at the moment which are arching their backs across the Western world, promising in different guises a movement away from policies of privatisation, austerity, deregulation and free trade. So you've got Trump in the US, you've got Le Pen in France, you've got the AFL and Die Linke both done really well in the German elections recently, the Communist Party in Portugal, you've got Syriza in Greece, of course we've got Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party here in the UK. All of them, from right and the left, are promising a mixed bag of policy offers which are completely alien to neoliberalism, from protectionism, state investment in industry, higher taxes on the wealthy, nationalisation and increased financial regulation. But I guess the open question is, are these scenes harbingers of an apocalypse for neoliberalism? And all I can say is, I hope so, but I'm not sure. And here's where I might agree slightly more with James, is that to a certain degree, I think that neoliberalism has actually been dead for some time already. Self-identified neoliberal thinkers are pretty much extinct. As a school of economic thought, neoliberalism has produced nothing new in the way of international global analysis and critique for quite a while. It hasn't introduced any new methodology for dealing with recent crises. It hasn't really produced any public political exponents coming out talking about neoliberalism. Neoliberal thinkers are not producing books anymore like they were in the 1980s. As an intellectual tendency, it seems to be dead. As an ideology, which achieved its heyday in the 70s and 80s, it was already in decline by the 90s. And was also an ideology which singularly failed in every practical example of application in the real world. What we're left with today really is more what I would call a neoliberal residue. It's a reflexive and somewhat unthinking policy response which is trained into our economic experts and politicians. Neoliberalism is really, you could describe it as the muscle memory of our policy wonks. They reflexively engage in fiscal austerity when faced with a crisis. There's not really an analysis of how this works, it's just the orthodoxy. But I think going back to the history, and again, I think Grace did a really good job on the history, but I'll try and go back and just talk a little bit more about some of the Keynesian sort of oppositional sort of elements to this beforehand. I think the school of neoliberalism emerged as a counterweight to the Keynesian post-war consensus, where Keynes had posited the importance of specifically counter-cyclical spending from the state, so particularly during eras of economic decline. And Keynes' ideas were forged really because of the total failure of free market policies in the interwar years to revitalise Western economies, with obviously tragic results. So after 1918, a debt chain ran throughout Europe, with Britain owing to the US and European allies owing to Britain, and at the bottom there was a total inability to begin the process of repayments. The answer at the time was that Germany should pay for it all, and that resulted in the Versailles Treaty, which is often attributed with the rise of nationalist resentment within Germany, which fed into an incipient Nazi movement. Further to this, there was a credit crisis due to unrecoverable loans during this period, which really sparked the Great Crash in 1931, which in turn led to price wars between the Western nations, each devaluing their currencies to gain a competitive advantage over each other, in line with the classical liberal economic orthodoxy, the classical liberal as opposed to the neoliberal. And the result, of course, was World War II. In response to this chaos, Keynes turned the founding supposition of the classical liberal economists on its head. So where traditionally liberal economists had claimed that supply creates its own demand, in Keynes's mind, demand creates its own supply. But being quite a simple rhetorical inversion, the consequences of this principle were very significant. Economics had traditionally focused on the availability and cost of labour power as a most significant factor in spurring economic activity. So this isn't just some sort of Marxist critique of neoliberalism, this is actually embedded into classical liberal thought. Labour supply was always represented in terms of available workers and low wages. So it was theorised that in times of crisis, the supply of labour should be increased to incentivise production, reducing wages, making work less secure, and creating a bank of unemployed people willing to work anywhere. This was the classical liberal economic model for dealing with crisis, reduce the cost of labour. Keynes argued inversely that it was actually the presence of demand for products in the market which spurred production. So rather than reducing working conditions, Keynes argued that the state should invest in construction projects, research and production to kickstart the market, create new jobs, get people into work so they had an income with which to further increase demands for goods and services. The success of Keynesian ideas is really what led to the post-war economic consensus, in which Western governments embarked upon widespread social infrastructural investment projects that were propping up the market whenever it failed. Internationally, the Keynesian consensus was represented by the Bretton Woods Agreement, which in a great historical irony, two of the main institutions associated with this agreement are now associated with neoliberal domination, that is the World Bank and the IMF, but were originally set up as a Keynesian solution to regulate global trade and make sure that there weren't too many imbalances in relative trade deficits between different countries, to try and even out trade deficits and ultimately normalise, regularise economic relations between different countries. Keynes' ideas were basically developed around a central distrust of the market as a mechanism to effectively distribute wealth, and a commitment on behalf of the state and other non-market political mechanisms to step in where it failed to do so. But I think here's where the real defining part of the neoliberals come in, because contrary to Keynes, the neoliberals basically wished to resurrect not all but some of the classical liberal ideals. So one central aspect of the classical liberal ideals which the neoliberals wished to reinvent was the importance of the price mechanism, put it right back at the heart of economic orthodoxy. And these ideas were inspired by really abstract concepts of interpersonal freedom, as expressed by early thinkers such as Friedrich Hayek. So for Hayek, unregulated markets provided a structure for voluntary human interactions, which he believed were intrinsically challenging to repressive political systems. They were also seen as partial rejoinders to the failings of the classical liberal school, and a role was actually seen for the state. So monetarism, which was Milton Friedman's baby, extolled that the most important facet of growth in market exchange was a stable currency. So the value of currency was dictated by the quantity of that currency in the market, and that the central bank should play an active role in regulating the quantity of money in circulation in order to control inflation. Supply-side economics, the slight sort of different sort of tendency on this, was developed under Ronald Reagan, which was a desire to rehabilitate the supply creates its own demand concept, but have a slightly less anti-worker slant on it. So supply-siders, rather than just seeing labour as the central sort of issue with regards to economic success, saw taxation as the primary obstacle to growth, and they postulated that the state revenue would actually be increased by reducing taxes, spurring growth and increasing base revenues. And on the whole, I think you can safely define this neoliberal school of thought as a tendency to see the market as a system through which demand can be organically and continually reassessed from the point of the consumer, encouraging innovation, improvisation and creativity, constantly reacting and adapting to new environments. Which makes it quite ironic that some of the first implementations of these neoliberal principles occurred through Latin American dictatorships. I'll actually go for before Pinochet as an example. I'd say in 1976, the Argentinian military junta, under the advice of the neoliberal economist Martina de Hoz, actually was the first government, I think, to formally adopt the neoliberal school ideas and start embarking upon a string of neoliberal policies designed to spur growth. So they imposed fiscal austerity in line with the monetarist method. Public sector salaries were frozen with the intention of putting an end to inflation. Borders were open to facilitate trade, taxes reduced, and the financial system was deregulated. Fiscal austerity immediately led to a drastic reduction in income for the working population as inflation continued and wages were devalued. Argentinian industry promptly collapsed after the opening up of trade borders, and the deregulation of finance led to complete financial ruin as domestic investment fled abroad during the Reagan era and bankers moved their assets elsewhere. Poverty during this period increased from 9% of the population in 1975 to 40% in 1982. There's loads more examples to hand, but for the sake of brevity, I'll limit it to one more in its introduction. Pre-crash Ireland is maybe the most obvious example of a failed neoliberal experiment, which is on our doorstep. Dubbed the Celtic Tiger, the Irish economy began to falter and crash in the mid-2000s, and Ireland is now the most indebted country in the EU, with a budget deficit running at 14.3% and 13.4% unemployment. Despite fiscal austerity, the deficit is growing, and young people in Ireland face an unprecedented housing crisis, with single-room flats regularly costing hundreds of euros a week to rent. It's a truly terrible situation. I've got some friends in Ireland at the moment, and it's absolutely dire. Time and time again, neoliberal policies have been found to drastically increase social inequality, which actually has a corollary impact on other areas of society. The academic Mark Fleming points to neoliberalism and the criminalisation of poverty as a major factor behind mass incarceration, which we see in the USA today. So here's, I think, an answer partly to what James was talking about the increase in state spending, because I don't think neoliberalism actually has a principle against state spending, it just has a principle against market intervention. But as the welfare state then has been taken away, the social safety net, which would once have kept citizens from hitting rock bottom, has also declined. If you combine this with the increasingly precarious nature of non-unionised work, you create a situation of insecurity and economic fear, which is a hotbed for criminal activity. The privatisation of prisons has also fed into this effect, with private prisons now amongst the largest corporate lobbyists in American politics. These prisons have, with varying degrees of success, lobbied for longer prison sentences, harsher border protection regimes, and more customs control. Inside prisons themselves, prisoners are being employed en masse for as little as 23 cents per hour, making flags, mattresses, military equipment, everything under the sun. This effect has become known by some as the prison industrial complex, which is a perverse byproduct of the introduction of the profit motive into an essential public service. The prison industrial complex is perhaps one of the most evocative and emotive instances of what academic Loic Bacan calls the centaur state. In response to the increasing social instability of post-neoliberal society, Bacan argues that authorities increasingly turn to punitive measures in order to temper an unruly population. And I think this is an example of where the state expenditure does not decrease, it actually just gets deflected. It becomes more about social order and retaining social control when it comes about providing essential service to those who are investing in industry, etc. And this is not the only problem caused by social inequality. In its 2016 paper entitled Neoliberalism Oversold, the IMF itself concludes three major issues on the neoliberal policies which it helped to explore around the globe. One, that the benefits of increased growth are really hard to establish over a broad group of countries. Two, that the costs of increased inequality are significant. The actual financial costs of increasing inequality are significant. I think the prison population is one potential example of that. And three, that inequality also challenges the sustainability of growth. The monetarist approach of the IMF has placed significant restrictions on the ability of developing countries to borrow and invest in scaling up their infrastructure, particularly in regards to public services and public health. The result has been a knock-on cycle of underdevelopment, in which underfunded public services provide demoralising and underpaid work, leading to brain drain as employees emigrate elsewhere. Failure to upgrade infrastructure in favour of fiscal tightening exacerbates the competitivity gap between developed and undeveloped nations, making them ever less capable of escaping the debt trap. And it's now fairly well established that neoliberal policy has led to a chronic underinvestment in key infrastructure such as roads, school, energy and industry. These unintended consequences to neoliberalism build up into a catalogue of errors which collectively discredit the ideological framework in its entirety as far as I'm concerned. So over time, neoliberalism can be seen to, one, undermine national sovereignty for exacerbating national budget deficits, national debt, and undermining the ability of national governments to plan for development locally instead of allowing global financial interests and developers to call the shots. Two, remove large-scale state-owned public companies and services which inadvertently undermine the previous efficiencies associated with economies of scale. Three, erode the conditions for worker productivity which would include decent terms and conditions, job security, etc. 4. Allow for the widespread destruction of the environment and natural habitats without any adequate regulatory bodies. And 5. Increase the power of unaccountable global companies as opposed to accountable political systems and politicians, which effectively undermines democracy. But I guess the question here is it about to die? And I'd like to just finish here with a bit of a warning. I think the strength of neoliberalism as a school of economic thought actually lies in its fundamental alignment to the basic tenets of capitalism. For an individual with wealth, there will always be an instrumental convenience in expounding a philosophy which dictates that your own personal interest is somehow the best thing for everybody. The concept of the invisible hand both allows individual profiteers to provide themselves with a moral whitewash for their activities and to kid themselves and others that their subjective interests are the best route to general prosperity. Faith in the market mechanism, as far as I can see, effectively boils down to these motivations. There is very little in the way of aggregate evidence to show that neoliberal free market capitalism is the most effective mechanism for sustained growth, general prosperity, or anything else. So in answer to the general premise of the question, I would say that I think that neoliberalism has a potential for longevity. If not as a current movement, then I think it's an idea which can very easily be resparked, because fundamentally it's very much aligned to the core principles by which we run the basics of our economy. Until that changes, I see it as a potential danger in years to come.